pleased to have you. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Donna. I'd like to welcome everyone to Stronger Together community. I'm really excited about moderating this panel of experts doing some amazing work with both Asian American and Black communities and building unity. We have an hour and a half, and there's a lot to talk about. And so I'm going to start off with introducing the panelists. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge Joanne Shu, who thought of and worked very hard to make this panel a reality. She curated this panel, has been working on it since the last year. Joanne is a graduate of Rutgers, New York's School of Social Work, and Fordham's Graduate School of Social Service at Lincoln Center. She's now an operations manager in a research lab at Northwell Health, addressing health equity. Now on to our panelists. Juan Blount-Hill, an assistant professor at the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University. Before ASU, he obtained a law license, served as a KC, South Carolina firefighter, a Charleston, South Carolina police officer, an evaluation researcher for John Jay's Research and Evaluation Center, a research manager for New York City Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, and director of research for the Brooklyn Prosecutor's Office. His current research is focused on social narrative and group identity and the influence of identity on perceptions and experiences of justice. Judge Victoria Pratt, JD, was the former chief judge of the New York NJ's Municipal Court and nationally and globally known for her work to reform the criminal justice system. She is the executive director of Odyssey Impact, a nonprofit that uses storytelling through documentary films to galvanize social change. She's also the author of The Power of Dignity, How Transforming Justice Can Heal Our Communities, which was released to critical acclaim, and a viral TED Talk, How Judges Can Show Respect. Don Cao, Director, Chinese American Planning Council's Project Reach. Over 52 years ago, he founded one of the earliest Midwest Asian American student organizations and initiated a coalition of Black, Latinx, Native American, Asian, and progressive white students to protest the closing of the African American and Native American centers. 38 years ago, in an action unprecedented among race-segregated youth programs in New York City, he opened the doors of Project Reach in Chinatown to Black, Latinx, and Italian youth and put in place one of the most diverse and unique anti-discrimination agencies in the country. Kim Tran, PhD, is an award-winning activist, author, and consultant. Since 2014, Kim has trained thousands of people on police alternatives to community safety and uprooting anti-Blackness in Asian American families. She received the Outstanding Community Leader Award from the California Legislative LGBT Caucus in 2021. Her forthcoming book is titled, We Could Be, Searching for Justice After Diversity. So I thought we could start. Welcome, everybody. I'm just waiting for, I think we're having some technical difficulties with Judge Pratt's camera. Hopefully we'll be able to resolve that really soon. But I thought we could start with what we see happening in our communities and some personal examples of what we see and why this work of community building is so important. So.
Sure, I would love to kind of kick us off here. I think one of the most visible things we've seen since the beginning of the pandemic has been a really tense conversation about policing, particularly in Asian American ethnic enclaves. So if you're in Chinatown in Oakland, which is where I am, you'll see sometimes a heightened police presence, and then also a really strong pushback to that heightened police presence. And the idea is the kind of central theme is, what are we doing to keep Asian American communities safe? And there's this really obvious conversation and argument and debate that a lot of folks are having between, is community safety something that only applies to Asian Americans who don't experience police brutality in the same way as Black Americans, or is community safety about all of us, right? And so that is one of the most, I think, prominent, visible national issues that we see Asian American communities actively figuring out when it comes to what solidarity and what unity really looks like.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you, Kim. Kwan?
Yeah, so I work in a university setting, and so one of the major debates that has been reflected in that setting, but I think is reflective across settings where groups are sometimes made to, go after some of the same resources, is what we mean by diversity, for instance, right? What we mean by who people of color are, and so things like, we have a diversity committee, and we need to get more diverse student candidates, but are we focused on Black and Brown folks? Are we focused on people of Asian descent? And I think that that's been a conversation that I've seen now in my workplace in a university setting, but also I've seen in workplaces when we've talked about diversity in other settings as well. And even with regard to family members, friends, there's a conversation about who deserves the focus and the attention when we talk about lack and scarcity with regard to people of color, and whether Asian Americans are included in that or whether they are differentiated from those of us who are Black or maybe identified as brown.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I was reading recently, we've heard about Florida and erasure of Black history in the teaching of schools. And then recently there was an article on how Asian American history must be taught in Florida schools. And I find it really interesting how the two communities are pitted against each other, right? And one community is erased, pitted by the larger establishment, so to speak, right? And what that does to creating unity and belonging and solidarity. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious about your thoughts on why are these challenges there? What makes it hard to work across differences?
Do you want me to go ahead and jump in the start?
Yeah, please.
So a lot of my research is on group psychology, right? And the kind of social psychology of group dynamics. And so when I think about an issue like this, I'm really thinking at an abstract level, but an abstraction that usually feeds into and is able to map onto the experiences at a more kind of like local or concrete level. And so I'm going to use myself kind of as an example. All of us sitting here at this panel, all of us who are listening to my voice right now, are a collection of identities, right? We're who we are, but we're a group or members of groups and stuff too. And so I'm Black, and so part of my identity is being Black. Part of my identity is being a university professor, for instance, or being a researcher, and that becomes really important. How that group is seen becomes really important. It becomes important because my group identity gives me a sense of belonging. So because I know that I'm Black, because I'm tied to Black culture and the Black group identity, it means that when I go off on a hike in Utah and see some other Black dude on the mountain with me, like we make eye contact and head nod and say, yeah, we're both here. So we have some commonality here. There's somebody here who has my back. It makes me feel good when Black people do good, right? For instance, having President Barack Obama to turn to as an example of Black success makes me feel good about the possibilities of what I can do. It brings a sense of social support and people who I can lean on, people who can work with me to accomplish goals. And so group identity is really, really important. But what that means is that when group identity becomes super important, especially in contexts where that group identity is like the major identifier. For instance, on a panel where you talk about race, I'm immediately aware of my race because that's something that's in the air, is what people are focused on. Then it also causes me to think about a number of things with regard to how my group is positioned to other groups. And so inevitably, for instance, you're going to have instances of in-group favoritism where I want to make sure maybe that the Black folks on the panel look really good and are speaking really well because I want people to associate Blackness with articulation. You have this sense of group comparison, right? So I want to make sure that the Black panelists are doing particularly well when you compare them against the other group on the panel, because I don't want the Black group to be seen as less capable, right? We all kind of do this almost without thinking of it, right? And bias in some cases against the out, right? So maybe I'm even more scrutinizing of those who are not part of my group in a way that helps to protect the identity of the group. And you can think about how you think about even yourself in comparison to others, right? You often compare yourself to others. And so you do the same thing with regard to group identity. The last thing I'll say, though, is that this tends to be enhanced in a couple of circumstances that find themselves often in articulation here in the United States, which is in instances of structural scarcity, right? Where it's like resources are few and those people have to go for just the few resources that are there. So I gave the example, for instance, of diversity within the university setting, where we only allow a few spots for diverse candidates, right? And there's a much higher likelihood that, say, white candidates get all the rest of those spots. You can still get the non-diverse candidate spots, but it's less likely. And so all the diverse candidates are fighting for those slots to make sure that they get an opportunity to be a part of the university system, the university atmosphere. And that pits groups who rely on diversity set-asides against each other, right? And so in that case, you're going to have an enhanced sense of competition. And also anytime that there's a group threat, right? Anytime that there's some sort of threat to the group's identity, its safety, its resources. So a lot of discussions, for instance, about Stop Asian Hate, when they seem to be contextualized or talked about in the sense of Black people being some of the offenders of those hate incidents, that immediately sets me on edge to think about, well, wait a minute, I don't want people thinking Black people are the cause. I don't want to increase policing of Black folks in Asian communities, for instance. And so all these things become really, really important phenomena that kind of impact how we look at group dynamics. I'll stop there.
So would the yes, Judge Pratt, please.
I wanted to talk about how our use of language, and while Don is our historian on the call, the use of language to pit the two groups against one another, and how it also helps us forget the history of the groups. And so when we talk about the internment of the Japanese, we are really talking about the incarceration of an entire group of people because of their race, even though they were Americans. And that this whole idea that Americans, because they were connected to or considered an other. And then when we look at what's happened to African Americans and continues this wholesale incarceration of a group of people, and we forget that it's incarceration where it's the government coming in and stripping people of their rights. When we look at the rails as they were built, first the Japanese and then the Chinese were brought in to replace, and we look at people who were recruited to do rails in the country. However, African Americans were incarcerated to build the rails in this country on the chain gangs. And so how those things begin to undermine relationships between a group of people historically, not understanding that neither one of them was in control of the situation that created it. And how language is used to really shift the reality and the truth of situations, and to kind of build this swell of misinformation and mistrust and inequality amongst groups of people. And so always being very careful that we are listening with two ears, or looking for a deeper truth around how we talk about people, and how subsequently, again, looking at another group who was incarcerated and received reparations. And then you have another group that's like, well, we still haven't been able to do that, and how that underlying animosity builds, and forgetting the history of all the coalition building that I know Don will talk a lot about later on.
Yeah.
Should I say something? I'm not so sure. I'm old, but I don't think I'm necessarily a historian. And Just so you don't have to do any guessing, I'm going to be 72 this year. So it's interesting. Just hearing everybody talking and I want to just pose a situation where Project Reach, where I work, we do anti-discrimination training. And so we were called in to address anti-Asian violence in a gifted and talented middle school in Harlem. Okay, so I thought, Harlem, gifted and talented. Interestingly, when we go there, there are very few Black and brown children in the school. Most of the children are South Asian or East Asian or white. And so I thought, so my stereotype, and I'm not supposed to stereotype, was, oh, the white kids must be doing the anti-Asian violence. Well, it wasn't. It was actually the South Asian students against the East Asian students. And the Black and brown children, the few that were there, would then jump on the bandwagon. And then the N-word became prolific and okay, because apparently the Black students weren't targeted. So it's just interesting to see how layered. I mean, we all look at the wedges that have been driven between the Asian and the Black community, or any number of other groups. But nobody looks at the root cause. And nobody ever talks about white supremacy. It's like, oh, what is that? We're talking about Black and Asian solidarity, but nobody looks at white supremacy and white privilege. And it has nothing to do with the race of white folks, but it has everything to do with the values and mores and stereotypes and misinformation and lack of history that ends up having everybody believe the stereotypes because we were never taught the history.
Yeah.
And that becomes really problematic. And so I shared something with Krish earlier, a quote. Are we able to show it?
I don't think so, but if
Okay, that's all right.
you know the quote by heart, or I can read it out.
Why don't you read it out? This is I've always been wondering, like, how did this all happen? And I know that when I was growing up, I wanted to be white before I was 18. Okay. What may shock people also was that I was a Republican and I was for the Vietnam War for all the reasons that the media and everybody was putting out, right? Freedom and liberty for all. We're stopping the communists, on and on and on. It wasn't until I went to college and found out that there was a lot of stuff I didn't know. And in doing my research, I ran across this quote. Do you want to read it, Krish?
Yep. At a time, and this is in quotes, at a time when Americans are awash in worry over the plight of racial minorities, one such minority, America's 300,000 Chinese Americans, is winning wealth and respect by dint of its own hard work. And there's a gap in when it is being proposed that hundreds of billions be sent to uplift Negroes and other minorities, Chinese Americans are moving ahead on their own with no help from anyone else, end quote.
So we use this in one of our exercises to just see what people's reactions are. And every decade, or when I first did this 40 years ago, all the Asians were going, oh, that's right. You know, we're really hardworking, blah, blah, blah. and of course, many Black folks also would say, oh, you know, it must be true. But what people don't realize is that this quote came from March 1966. Most people who have not learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act didn't realize that from 1882 until 1965, Chinese couldn't even come into this country. Japanese were kept out from 1924, and Filipinos were then excluded in 1934. So an entire race pretty much has been excluded from coming into this country. So when an immigration law changes in 1965, it takes 3 years for people to start immigrating. So how is it that this media promotes Asians as being the successful model minority when they haven't even gotten back into the country yet.
Mm.
So it begs the question, who wrote this article? Was it the
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead, Kim.
I'd love to add a little bit to the I think phenomenal wisdom that Dawn brings to this panel, and I just want us to think about what it means to be an invisible community of color in America. Just for a second, I'm going to tell you what that looks like. And so there are a lot of interesting questions happening in the chat and the Q&A, and I want to address a couple of them because there are assumptions that are made based on like what's inside of these questions. And one of the things that we see a lot of within Asian American communities is the erasure of our relationship to other communities of color. I think like Judge Pratt was saying, we're talking about the railroads, we're talking about a group of laborers that was actually brought into the country in order to sow division between Black folks and white folks. Asian Americans weren't enslaved Africans, but they certainly weren't free white laborers. And so they were kind of in this indentured place, right? And since we were brought to this country, that has been the relationship that we have had. It's this erased kind of model minority part that completely invisibilizes the actual plight of being Asian American. And I don't think we actually need to go all the way back to the Page Act. We can just think about the fact that Asian Americans are a racial community in America that has the largest racial wealth gap of any community of color. So in one community, you will have South Asian women who out-earn white men, but also people like me who are Vietnamese. I make the same as a Black woman in terms of my pay gender gap. 63 cents on the dollar, folks. I'm a Vietnamese woman. Are we ever talking about me? My story, being working class, being raised by a single mom, a mom who was a union member. I am an organizer and I have been one since I was 3 years old. You don't hear my story. You see Crazy Rich Asians on TV, and then there's this assumption that we all look like model minorities, that we all have tremendous amounts of formal education. And then all that's lost is the fact that Asian Americans, we call ourselves Asian Americans, because we wanted to build coalition with Black, Indigenous, and Latinx folks. That's where Asian American came from. It's not a census category. It's something that activists decided on in the 1960s, right? You don't see that. And then what we do actually fixate on is things like, oh, Asian and Black tension in Chinatown, Black folks perpetrating anti-Asian violence. But 75% of the anti-Asian violence since 2019 has been perpetrated by white people. But the viral videos are the same thing we see in media depictions of Black folks, right? That's what it looks like to be erased as a group, as a community of color. And that is actually how division works.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead. Go ahead, Chris.
Earlier when I was talking to Don, when we were talking about this quote, he had actually said something really interesting, which is which Asian identities, which Asians get seen and made visible, and which Asian identities get made invisible or erased, right? As part of this model minority myth. And I really liked the notion that Dawn had put forward in one of our conversations of, is it a model minority or a manipulated minority? Right? Because what you both are talking about is how a community was manipulated and pitted against Blacks and African Americans in order to serve white supremacy. And so we don't talk about white supremacy. We just talk about amongst ourselves and fight.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I find so deeply troubling is that when we talk about solidarity, we tend to fixate on the 60s and the 70s and the coalition building that happened there. But since 2014, Asians for Black Lives has started chapters across the country, and they are systematically doing solidarity work with Black American communities in the Twin Cities, in Southern California. In Los Angeles, you have Koreatown for All, and that's predominantly Asian Americans doing anti-Blackness work in their own community. And so that idea of manipulated minority, I really love, because I think it's not even just manipulated externally, it's also what we think of ourselves. If we stop thinking about ourselves as people who are capable of political action, who are alone in taking this kind of action, it starts to feel really alienating to do. And when you understand that you've got history at your back and you have organizations in front of you doing this work, it's so much more like obvious as a political horizon, right?
Mhm.
I like that we're talking about this idea of white supremacy, and that white supremacy is about protecting privilege and maintaining your position. And so when we talk about manipulating stories, and again, language around what the narrative is, we're looking at this pending Supreme Court case about affirmative action and this whole history around forgetting that Asians fought for affirmative action early on, had to. And once they began to dominate these elite schools that were preserved for the white elite, they were labeled overrepresented. And so this idea of flushing Asians out by just not letting them in the schools.
Mhm.
And now someone has captured this narrative and said, oh, no, 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 it's not, we're not keeping you out the school. It's those unqualified Black folks. So let's turn the narrative on to them. And that we play this game. There's a Supreme Court that's willing to hear it and push this narrative forward, and how dangerous it is, because once again, pitting these groups against one another, but that the Black and brown children who are really going to suffer as a result of this hijacking of the narrative of what's really happening, and that these are not places that were intended for us to go to and to be and to use, and so again, once again, protecting white supremacy, protecting
Yeah.
privilege, protecting things that we were not supposed to have a part of. And I don't hear anyone screaming about this when we have these conversations about what this talk is about affirmative action. Because when you go into a lot of these affirmative action programs, you'll see predominantly white women, and you'll see a large number of Asian people. So again, where are the Black students who were supposed to, and the Latina students who were supposed to, I'm so sorry, but who are supposed to also have a part of this and also be able to change their life's trajectory as a result of it. But it's this game of, oh, no, no, it's not us, it's them. So figuring out how we can recapture the narrative so that we are not, again, the losers in there. The next generation of young people are not the losers in this.
I
I-
think,
Oh,
go ahead, Don, sorry.
I was just going to say, I think that it's also really important to understand that white supremacy not only erases our histories, but it just omits it altogether. And so what people don't realize is that why is it that some Asians, we should say, but everybody sees all Asians are doing better on the SATs. Of course, now they're getting rid of the SATs, thank God. But anyway, that white Asian students are doing better than white students on the SATs, and nobody wants to look at the impact of in 1966, when you promote a group that hasn't even come back into the country as being the model minority, then what do the guidance counselors and the educators do from that point on? Well, what they do is they track the Asians into academics, even more so than they do whites. They track the Black and brown folks. If they even track them into educational programs, it's usually vocational or lower paying, unskilled areas. And then nobody wants to look at the difference economically in terms of what's going on in the Asian community versus the Black community. And one thing I do, I don't mean to simplify it, but I often ask people, what's the Chinese community that everybody knows about? Oh, it's Chinatown. What's the Black community? Of course, now I'm showing my age. I'd say Harlem, but Harlem is no longer Black, with all the gentrification. But when you look at those two things, what's the major difference? Chinese own all their own businesses in their community. Black people have never been allowed to own their businesses because of redlining, right? The only places it happened was in Rosewood or in Tulsa. And what happened there? It was separate but equal.